did my tests yesterday, so we know that this works. So welcome to SaaSOps Live virtual event, SOLVETank style. This is actually episode 10. Would you believe it? Up until now, we've had 9 vendors on to come and pitch and show their product to us, and then we give our feedback. But this week, we don't have a vendor on to do a demo. We have a VC. So welcome, John. John is the founding partner of Decibel, an independent venture capital firm pushing the conventional boundaries of early stage investing. John's here to talk to us about his view of the SaaS marketplace, what types of SaaS applications are pitched to him, and what he looks for in SaaS applications to ultimately invest in. But most importantly, he's going to hear from all of the other SaaS professional colleagues here about what they need in SaaS applications and SaaS management, and potentially what he should be investing in. So thank you, John, for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
No, thanks, Colin, for having me, and I'm excited to have a great discussion with all of you. Perhaps I'll just start from the beginning and tell you a little bit about where I started in my career, how I got to what I'm doing now, the kinds of things that Decibel invests in, and of course, where we think the software and SaaS world is going. First, I should let you all know that I'm a recovering entrepreneur. So I started my first company when I was 24. If you remember, before there was Facebook and Friends, there was instant messaging, AOL Instant Messenger, AIM. I'm sure many of you had a screen name. There was ICQ, there was Skype, there was MSN. So I'm getting lots of nods. So I built an instant messaging firewall. So if you remember in the early 2000s, everybody was using this technology, but nobody was controlling it. Nobody was managing it. Nobody was monitoring it. It was the wild, wild west. And so we built a firewall that would allow people like you to stop bad things from coming in or stop good things from going out when people were using IM. So we could monitor people's conversations. We could stop viruses from coming in. We could see that people were sharing confidential information externally. And we tried to do everything we can to leave the fun in IM, but naturally, once we brought this technology in and people knew that they were being monitored and controlled and watched, people were using it more responsibly. And so, of course, I think what we ended up doing was taking a lot of the fun out of IM. But needless to say, I think it was a really important place and time in the world, and our company was eventually acquired by Symantec. I then, at Symantec, helped build out what was called the enterprise message management business. So that was email, instant messaging, web conferencing, and collaboration tools, being able to let people use those tools safely and securely and compliantly. And then I eventually joined a venture capital firm called New Enterprise Associates, NEA for short. It was one of the oldest and largest venture capital funds here in the US. It was headquartered in Silicon Valley, also had a very big presence on the East Coast. And while at NEA, I invested in early stage software and internet companies. And we were very early investors in SaaS. Very famously, we were very early investors in Salesforce.com. We were then early investors in companies like Workday, and then eventually invested in both vertical SaaS companies and also the underlying infrastructure companies that were required to support software as a service. So that led us to cloud services, that led us to open source and a lot of data infrastructure and enabling technologies that I think now are part of the many, many, many components of software that are required to deliver software as a service. So it's been a fun time. I grew up in this industry, so I remember building servers and putting both proprietary and early open source software together and building them and literally physically taking them to customers. So that was me when in my early 20s was, trying to use things like MySQL because SQL Server was too expensive, all the way through to, hosting early events with Amazon where they would come and meet with customers and CIOs to talk about what cloud computing could be. And very humbly, they actually did not even really think that enterprises would use cloud computing in the late 2000s and early 2010s. They were just very, very humbly shocked that enterprises were even trying things like EC2 and S3. Fast forward to now, I think everybody recognizes that all software ultimately is delivered as a service in one way or another. Sometimes we dress it up differently, sometimes we describe it differently, but I think it's been a fun 20 years to be in this business, and unquestionably, I think the best is yet to come. When I go back in time and talk about software as a service, I would say like the first generation. So if I describe the past in one giant chapter of a book, I would say we were moving on-premise software to a hosted or cloud version. So if you think about some of like the biggest successes in the early generation of software, we were moving Decibel or CRM systems to Salesforce, or we were moving, um, excuse me, Oracle financials to Workday. And it was not all that different what the software did. So if you remember, like we had to still meet enterprise requirements. So the first generation of true software as a service companies were effectively a rewrite of the prior generation of companies. So if I think about like in the 1990s enterprise software, we had ERP, we had CRM, we had document management systems, and then we just built those products again in the cloud. And that's largely speaking the early successes of the 2000s. I think if you went through and looked at almost all of the companies that were successful in the mid 2000s, there really weren't that many public ones, and they were all effectively rewrites of the first generation of on-premise software. I think what you started to see in the early 2010s was the rise of these more peripheral applications in departments that were largely underserved by the traditional ERP and CRM software. So if you looked at a list of public SaaS companies in the early 2010s, you would see Salesforce and you would see Workday, but then you see a bunch of HR companies, right? You'd see SuccessFactors and Connexa, and there's a lot of HR in the public SaaS comp list, and I think a lot of that is because if you think about the building blocks of enterprise software, we sold these like big enterprise horizontal stacks, and we pushed them on companies with consultants primarily, right? Customization. You bought $10 million of Oracle software and you bought $40 million of implementation with it to make it your thing. And my suspicion is the HR guys didn't really get their thing. So I think part of the reason why you saw like this kind of like pocket of great SaaS companies emerge in the early 2010s around departments that were underserved is because they were peripheral systems that were never really served by the kind of like core ERP and CRM stacks. So I would say the first 10 years of software was largely like the big building blocks being moved into cloud or hosted services, and then kind of like the rise of these like vertical or departmental or peripheral solutions that were underserved by that generation. I think what we're living in right now, like the present, is that trend continued to evolve over time, which eventually led to people saying, hey, like this software seemed one size fits all, but it's not really for me, right? I need something that's a little bit different. And SaaS has not really had much of a consultant ecosystem, right? So in the old days, we would like rewrite these, we would like build a bunch of components to make this piece of legacy software work for you. But SaaS is different, right? It's delivered as a service, and so there was much more of a need for personalization that was not being met by consultants. So you did not see the big four show up and say, "Hey, I really want to build, a custom implementation version of this SaaS product for you," because it was a business model shift for them to give up doing the on-premise work to go to cloud and to pick up SaaS. So I think that was the rise of the era that we're in now, which is, if you notice, it's becoming more end user driven, or sort of like more line of business driven or more persona driven, where a lot of very savvy entrepreneurs have said, hey, like this software really doesn't work for me, and it's a pretty big use case that I have, and that's why I really can't imagine using only Salesforce or Workday or Box or Dropbox for this use case. I really want to create something new and different. And that works for me. And these ideas might have started out seemingly very nichey, but then have become, sort of like much more popular and more sustainable and faster growing than maybe people had thought, because they were, maybe opening up for the creative spaces that people needed that they weren't getting from their legacy tools. So, when I look at, more recent successes of companies, whether it's, hey, Excel doesn't quite work for me. I'm not sure Google Sheets works for me either. This spreadsheet hasn't really changed much in a long time. And now we've got Smart Sheets and we've got Airtable, and, they're like slightly different, more personalized versions of what people need. But they are fulfilling very unique use cases for an individual, and that's why it captures that persona and why those companies are successful.
Right. It's a very interesting pivot to how it is, as you said, it's changed from the HR need to have things in the cloud to being end user driven by their needs. Have you seen a change in the type of SaaS applications that those end users have been I guess asking for, searching out for?
Well, it's funny. I mean, we're all SaaS users, right? So I would say, like, there's almost no limitation to what customers, being us, will imagine or demand in our lives. And maybe another space I would point to is things like design, right? So we have we had a very Adobe centric world for design, and there was a lot to love about that, but there was a lot of friction around Adobe products, and they are relative. I mean, I think many of us grew up using things like PageMaker and Photoshop, and these are great tools, as is PowerPoint. These are all very rich and robust tools, but then people eventually begin to realize that, hey, we need things like Canva and Figma and Sketch, and so this entire creator universe is, they're using all these tools. They're not using sort of a subset of them. And um, I think like, if you take this to its extreme, um, there are probably going to be thousands of successful SaaS applications, because I think we've gone from dozens to hundreds, right? So I think many of you would say, hey, I think I have like somewhere between 30 and 300 SaaS tools today. So and I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I don't think you're going from 30 to 300 back to 30, or 30 to 300 to 10, right? So I don't think that's kind of betting against gravity. It's betting against entropy. So
Right, I was just say the struggles with managing all of that is what a lot about what we've discussed over in our solve calls in the last year, and what a lot of our conversations are about amongst ourselves. So are you seeing, obviously a lot of us are invested in SaaS management and the SaaS management sphere. Are you seeing a growth in that? Are there unique things that you're seeing that we aren't seeing, that sort of at the pitch level?
Around SaaS management specifically, I guess I would maybe unbundle the statement of management and maybe create slightly different buckets around where I think the opportunities are. And some of these things help end users and help the business, and some things help more conventionally IT or the enablers of the business. So first, I think there's just like access, right? How do I use SaaS applications, and how do I discover SaaS applications, and how do I, kind of like find ways to get people up the ladder as quickly as possible? So I think, like, going from the wild, wild west of everybody brings their own to, hey, I still want to enable and sort of streamline access. I think that is um, a still like relatively underserved market. Like, I think people today, feel like SSO and Okta is kind of like what they've got, but I think that's like that's kind of like just like the beginning of getting into a world of discovery of, hey, like, there's knowledge and information, and there's a lot to be seen and learned from what everybody is doing on 300 different tools. And how do I figure out ways to navigate that information and find that information and share that information? So I think, like, this sort of like access and discovery plane is a really unsolved problem. Like, I think we're still still kind of like, well, I searched on it in Salesforce, and then I also looked inside Slack, and then I also looked inside G Suite, and I still really don't know what the answer is. So I then went into Asana, and then I went into Airtable, and I still don't, it's just like the problem keeps going on and on and on. And it's like, what is the system of record for this knowledge? Well, it's kind of everything. And so I think that is an area that we do see a lot of companies coming to us and saying, look, like the knowledge is there, but there is no system of record for that knowledge. And if you guys remember, there was this term called a knowledge base, and I'm laughing because I think we all know that like the only thing that we know about the knowledge base is that it's out of date, right? It doesn't really know anything. And so, you know, it's like the concept of like document management system and centralized portal and knowledge base. I mean, that's really, really out of date. And you know, I think that that's a you know, that is an unsolved problem today.
For the problems that companies are trying to solve, and they pitch to you, what do you? I would love to know what you look for, because obviously in this expanding SaaS management market, it is interesting how you say that you feel that term needs to be broken down, because it is a very broad category that's being tagged under the name of SaaS management. For anybody, you know, who's pitching to you, what's the sort of the differential that you look for?
Colin, can I just clarify?
Yeah.
Are you asking me when people are trying to add to your workload by introducing new tools, or are you talking about people who are trying to help you to manage the chaos of all these new tools?
Either. What's, I guess we can separate the administrative part of our brain, and if we all engage the user part as well, what tools that we would need. I'd be very interested to hear what's emerging in the market that you're seeing at that very early investor level.
Well, I think going back to a comment that I made earlier about, you know, like we're only limited by our imagination. I really think we are looking for people that truly understand a persona and have a tool that does automate and augment what they do at work every day, and in some way saves them time, saves them money, just makes their life easier and better, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, like, you know, everyone's really trying to just make the most of their time, and that translates to lots of different things. But you know, a lot of why these products that have early adopters who are you know, emotional and evangelical about usage is because they for the first time feel like this tool understands them. And you know, software is written by humans to help, again, automate and augment what a human's doing every day. So it's probably not surprising that, you know, if you get somebody who really understands that persona, they're going to plug into the matrix in a way like no other, and the user is going to understand that. So the user will say, gee, this tool was made for me because this is the way I think, and this is the way I do my job. And that's not what Microsoft Excel is, or that's not what G Suite is, or that's not what Salesforce.com is. Like, that was built for this guy or this girl. And I'm over here doing something very different. And everyone tells me, just go use Salesforce for that. And it doesn't quite work. And so that's, I think at the earliest stage, we see that in many different ways. We see that not only in like the passion and this is highly subjective, but it is something that you can measure in things like NPS or virality, or, you know, kind of like organic growth of a product. You can see all of that early on because like the customer base is just so evangelical. But then similarly, I think a lot of this software is, you know, sort of built to grow. All right. I mean, you guys may have heard of this term product-led adoption. You know, I think a lot of entrepreneurs who are training themselves in the 2020 decade to build a great company, you know, they're learning from 2 decades of software, and they're, you know, not trying to build giant field sales forces that come and call you and take you golfing and go to steak dinners. They are trying to build companies that are, you know, in a way like trying to convince users to be their best advocates. And so there's lots of different ways that they can do that. I mean, you know, many of you, I'm sure, in the consumer world notice that, you know, you download an app and the first thing it does is it asks you to like recommend the app to your friends and ingest your contacts and, you know, send coupons to friends. I luckily the B2B software world doesn't work that way, but the psychology of getting the user to be your advocate and to have sort of like the influencers be the users themselves versus Gartner is a very, very big systemic shift in the business. I mean, I think that there are now many, many, many billion-dollar companies that the Gartner never recommended to people. So, that's kind of like the shift that we're seeing in this market. It's like the influencers are the users, the kind of like more centralized gatekeepers of knowledge are struggling to like hold on to that position, right? The internet has this like funny way of kind of like trumping the centralization of knowledge. And I think that that's one of the biggest differences that we look for when we're trying to back somebody. And Decibel invests in a lot of technical founders who are building technical products sold to technical users. I mean, even people like you. And again, the technical buyer in particular is a very distinct user, right? They're maybe not the type of person that is going to respond well to a lot of hype and smoke and mirrors and kind of like wholly just responding to a brand campaign. There's a lot of, hey, like, I don't really care what you say, I just want to try the product. So please, please, please stop talking because I just want to try your product. And that's a very, very different kind of user than somebody who's like, hey, I haven't heard of you. So because I haven't heard of you, I don't want to try your product. And there's I think a technical founder tends to have great documentation versus say like a non-technical founder who has a really great website. And that's like, it's a little bit of a difference in how people are building products these days. They're really trying to get inside the psyche of the user and to make sure that they can connect with them in the way that they want to be connected with.
Right, excellent. That's wonderful insight into the SaaS marketplace and how it's I guess different areas and that human element that gets captured and the different types of innovators. I would love to. I can tell from my colleagues' faces that there's a lot of nodding, a lot of agreement, a lot of soapboxes probably need to be pulled out and jumped on to start little rants. So I would like to open the floor. Obviously, if this was in a physical place, we would walk around with a microphone and have people asking questions one person at a time. So we'll have to do this virtually. Who has a question? Randy, I saw your hand up first. Let's do physical hands instead of virtual hands. Yeah, because I don't think we have virtual hands in this Zoom. Randy.
I'm interested to see from the investor side and from your technical background, what your opinion is of like the SSO SAML tax, and without creating some sort of crappy false equivalency, what you think as investors could do to proactively be a part of that for the companies they're investing in, just sort of as if they look for a company with good ethics and maybe something now, especially with good diversity and things like that. Well, this SSO tax thing, in my opinion, is becoming so awful. It's got to happen somewhere, and certainly it doesn't seem to be happening at the company's levels. So who can affect this? And I'm curious your opinion on that.
So first, I think inside of that question are some assumptions, and I just want to revisit all of them because maybe there are some people that don't understand the point of the question, or I may be coming from a different angle. So first is many software companies that use software as a service have relatively frictionless distribution. So it allows users to try these products for a very low price point. And then over time, as a company begins to use the product more widely, there are enterprise features which cost more. And those enterprise features frequently start with something called SSO integration. So that is the ability to integrate your fun SaaS app into the sort of more centralized system of record for identities, access, authorization, and ultimately things like billing. So that can be quite expensive to turn on. And so people tend to call that the SSO tax, that like you kind of gave this away for free and now you're asking me to pay all this money to make it work inside my system. And sometimes people have a little bit of distaste in their mouth because now there are dozens, if not hundreds of companies that are doing something similar. So I just want to pause there. Is that sort of like the heart of the question?
It is, and you have a very interesting viewpoint. So I like this. This is great.
We've as a group, we have often complained about paying additional fees for those type of enterprise features, which we feel maybe not entitled to, but we should have them as a standard enterprise package. We have never considered the element of the additional costs that go into it. We just think it's a tick box. You just turned it on.
We have considered that.
Yes.
And I've spoken to vendors before, literally built the SSO that I'm going to be using.
Right. Yes. Yeah. If they don't have it, but obviously they have built it. So why, unless it costs?
For mature companies, you're right. We think about it as like a checkbox, basically.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, John, in the way that you were, I think in the way that you were sort of outlining that, there's actually two things that you were combining. One is the sort of freemium model of like low price point to enterprise price point. And another is SSO as an enterprise only feature. And I think in Randy's question, and certainly for many of us, we see a separation between those two. And they're both irritants in their own ways, but I think they're different things. And it's worth considering them as being different things.
Right. And nobody said this, is it like, please stop overcharging us for SSO and find new and creative ways to charge us for something else? Is that what I'm like largely I'm getting some nod? Is that?
Well, certainly don't charge us for too much more else, but yes, in concept, yes.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you. So one is remember that this space is relatively young, right? So I think in general, again, part of why I went through the timeline is to go back in history and remember that if we just go back 10 years, there weren't that many people doing SaaS. The low friction adoption approach is also relatively new. So if I go back to even like the first generation of companies, they were using inside sales, and they're really, it was like a free trial, but it wasn't freemium. And so this sort of like this usage-based model is relatively new. And I think it is fair to say that it has become mainstream. And I think it is also fair to say that it is a little unfair to say that this really important feature should always be off the list and we should always charge people a ton of money for it. So I think if you can see the best in how we got here, for a founder, it is the clearest way to know whether or not a company actually really cares about embracing its enterprise licenses, or very candidly, whether it's even an enterprise, right? Because I mean, ultimately, if you've not implemented Okta or an SSO system, or you're still kind of thinking about whether or not you want to implement something with an SSO system, you're likely a younger company or a company that is not as resourced to really care about the enterprise features. So I think that is kind of how we got here. I think it was, hey, we need to come up with a clear way to delineate like who has money to spend and who doesn't. We really don't want to tax the poor. So what's the best way to tax the rich? And the best way to tax the rich was to come up with something that only rich companies buy, and that at the time was expensive SSO system. So I think that's the history as to how we got here.
Okay, that's a great insight. Better view for us.
Yeah, and Randy, I think you're right though, and that is, hey, there's got to be a better way. You can't just tax us for SSO because we're all using SSO now, and this is becoming like a sort of like a fundamental way for us to implement SaaS software. So you can't every single time I want to embrace your product tell me that I have to pay this massive tax, because that just seems unfair in a world where we're going from 30 to 300 to 1,000 SaaS apps that I want to use. So that's absolutely fair. Now, I do think some things are already shifting in that area. So I do think a lot of companies are moving more towards usage-based pricing. And And I think
I'll just say I'm not a fan of Slack, but I do love their pricing model. Fair using pricing. I've tried to get all of my SaaS vendors to do it. It makes licensing so much easier. You know, I'll pay for usage, but I don't like paying for a license not being used, and it removes that license usage and allocation problem that we have.
No, and look, I think with any kind of pricing discussion, we can have a "I love you, I hate you" conversation, right? So I know that like no one really likes to pay for anything at the end of the day, but I do think that it does logically start to make more sense, especially as we're evolving SaaS, to not tax everybody every time that you just want to properly implement something from the wild west into the more centralized system. That actually I think does not make long-term sense, because we want to allow everyone to use everything, and we want to bring everything into the fold without having it be a negotiation just because you're trying to actually enable your company to use it. And I absolutely think that we're probably in this transitional point in the evolution of SaaS and software where that is the case. And so the light at the end of the tunnel is utilization-based pricing is becoming way more successful. So you are seeing companies like Twilio or Snowflake or Slack as examples where people are saying, wow, these might actually be better businesses because we're not taxing the wealthy. We're effectively charging for value. So if you're getting a lot of value out of these products, then you should be paying more than the next guy. And if you are unhappy with that price, you really should go talk to your users and say, hey, like, how much value is there really in this product? Because it seems like I'm getting charged a lot for it, and you guys seem to be using a lot of it. And so that, I think one of the reasons why we're not quite there yet is it's a lot harder to build great utilization-based pricing. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of customers also don't like the uncertainty of it. So I think on the vendor side, the vendor says, well, gee, I really don't want to like scare these guys off. I want them to use as much of it as they can. And, I can afford to do that. So I'd like you to, you get as much value out of it. And certainly on your side, I think you like the idea of not waking up to an Amazon budget that is going like this every day and nobody knows how to control it. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're not quite there yet is I think we're all trying to learn how to price more to value as opposed to only taxing the rich.
Interesting. Great. Anybody else got a comment, question, suggestion? Rose there. Hey.
I was just going to shift gears just a little bit. I've noticed a trend in maybe not like the early SaaS companies, but in late stage funded companies, focusing a lot more on security. Like we're seeing a lot more SaaS companies who have SOC 2 certifications or are pursuing ISO 27001. How do you see that trend going? And do you think, what are your thoughts about how that's been influenced by both the users and the companies who are purchasing software?
I'm really glad you brought this up. So one, I think your community is a big part of this. So for those that are watching that are not as familiar with this trend, so it used to be the case that software companies with freemium models would invest more on end user functionality and less on things like security and compliance and enterprise readiness because they wanted to move fast and break things and get in front of users as quickly as possible and innovate, and then later on figure out how to solve all those problems. I think in the last 10 years, there's been hacks, there's been data breaches, and probably most importantly, the vendor community has created more balance with customers where the customers now are not allowing their users to embrace these tools, or certainly the vendors are not paying for these tools until certain standards are met. And one of the most important one is SOC 2. And yes, we are unquestionably seeing companies embrace SOC 2 compliance much, much earlier in their lifetime. And in fact, there's actually a burgeoning ecosystem of companies now that actually help software companies that are high growth develop and learn and build SOC 2 compliance early in their life. So I think we can all say that this is just good for the industry. And if you ask me like, is the trend going to continue and where is it heading? I actually think it's getting to the point now where you can't really go into market in a serious way without actually having this. where I see seed and Series A companies now coming to me saying, hey, I really need to actually do SOC 2 earlier than I thought. And it's because I just can't imagine going through vendor questionnaires and going through procurement processes and spending all of this time and all of this money without actually doing this. So it's a market enabler for them. It's an efficiency for them. And it's just the right thing to do. I mean, I think at the end of the day, half the founders are doing this because they just feel like it's the right thing to do, because it's becoming business risk for them to lose people's data or have a sort of a reputational breach early in their life because they're not as thoughtful about your data as they should be. Now, to give the prior generation of companies credit for this, or not credit, but rather to explain why this wasn't as important 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I don't think there was as much knowledge about how important it was when you are a hosted cloud service to have best of breed data protection. And also to have best of breed code protection, because in some ways we're all learning this together, and they did not understand what it meant to hold on to all of this data, because these companies grew almost overnight. I mean, Dropbox, as an example, just grew overnight, right? And Box was intentionally built from day one to be more secure, but Dropbox was not. And it's not because Box was a bad company. It just wasn't as widely known that if you don't solve this problem in the beginning, it really kind of shows up in a bad way in the end. But that's not what's happening now. What's happening now is people are growing up in an era of data breaches. They're growing up in an era of understanding GDPR. GDPR it's a commonly understood concept now for SaaS companies to say, hey, I have data and I need to think about where it sits, because if I ever want to sell to people outside of this country, or even like in states that are picking up regulation that is different than the state that I live in, I better figure out where this data is living. And it's just becoming table stakes now.
Yeah. I had one of those cloud webcam security companies emailed me asking to sort of if I was interested in their product. And I had to say, unfortunately, due to your security breach a few months ago, I can't consider you as a vendor. So it does show. I'm pleased to hear that you're seeing that investors in the emerging companies are treating security as a priority from the first instance. And I know myself, I get very annoyed when we look at and we trial a SaaS program that says that it's got an enterprise SKU or an enterprise features, but they don't have things like privileged access control for administrators and any other sort of what we would consider a standard admin controls.
There may be some.
Also sort of a running joke in our community about SaaS vendors who are like, I'm secure because I'm in AWS, or I'm secure because I'm in GCP and I'm leveraging their things. And I'm like, that's not security, but thank you.
Well, I was going to say, I think you guys should keep asking for it. I mean, I honestly don't think it was the investors that pushed the community this way. I think it's been the market. So when founders say to me, I'm getting my SOC 2, it's not because they are doing it to take vitamins and feel better about themselves. They're doing it because they can't sell to you without it. And that's pushing the founder community to do it earlier. And I love that, because I in our job, sometimes we feel like we're coaching and enabling. Sometimes it feels like we're parenting, and obviously no one wants to be parented. So we sometimes sit there and say, hey, like, you really need to go get your SOC 2. And sometimes it falls on deaf ears because they think it's just that the investor wants them to do the right thing, versus the customer saying, I'm just not paying for this unless you have this. And that's just a completely different conversation. It goes from being, this stick of, hey, you got to do this, otherwise, I'm not happy with you, to this market enabler of, I can't really sell anything without this. And then you've got sales teams and go-to-market teams are saying, look, you got to get this, because like we can't even get in the front door here without this.
Yeah,
so
I was going to say, I think a lot of us would be hesitant of even doing trials for new emerging SaaS programs if it didn't have those those basic security measures in place. All right, cool. Yeah, we got 10 minutes left. Andy's got another question. Any others?
Along similar lines, are you starting to see, so security now is something that's well established. We're starting to see, or we're starting to request, in fact, more in terms of accessibility and more in terms of carbon, and sort of other sort of more broad effects from a software perspective. Are you starting to see that being addressed with the companies you're talking to too?
Sorry, Andy, I didn't catch the second word. So you said accessibility, and what was the second word?
And carbon impact. So
okay, all right. So sustainability.
Sustainability, yeah.
Andy, I think the answer is there is some change here. It is perhaps at a faster change than it was, say, 5 to 10 years ago, but it is not anywhere near as in the ecosystem and in the conversation and reaching the top 1, 2, or 3 priorities as you might imagine. I, as somebody who has invested in sustainable companies and companies that are trying to, move people from fossil fuels to renewable energy and to drive energy efficiency, I have personally put a lot of my time in my career into this area. I think in general, entrepreneurs are trying to look at the human side of their organizations first, because there's a lot of work to do there. So people are starting to try to figure out, how to build diversity and inclusion into their companies, and maybe to have sustainability as a part of the mission of the employees. But I don't yet see that being implemented in their software, meaning what are the features that we're building to ensure diversity, inclusion, sustainability, accessibility. These are not things I'm yet seeing. And I think that might be where we will go at some point in the future, because I do think that this generation of founders cares more about this than the prior generations of founders did. Not because the prior generation of founders weren't thoughtful, but because there's more awareness now about the issues. And so I think because this generation is growing up with more awareness, they care more.
Yeah, certainly. We're in our organization certainly seeing those sort of questions being asked by more end users as well as
the current 25-year-old founder. The current 25-year-old founder, that would be kind of me, is definitely thinking more about this. And even if I look at my peers who I hire or other people hire, we just demand it and you can't ignore it anymore. But the implementation is still like, every time we have a vendor on and I ask that question, they always say, what are you asking here? And we don't have numbers. No one has any kind of good response there. And there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'm going to be not quiet. And I will never be quiet. And thanks, Andy, for asking this time.
That's how change happens.
I have a suggestion for everybody, and I'll use Rosa's question around SOC 2 as a good proxy for this, and that is, I think people just need a target, something that's specific, that's tangible, that's a set of requirements that people can build to, because I don't think that exists today. So I think you can beat up vendors all you want. We're all entitled to do that. But I also think like there's nothing specific that they're being asked to do yet. And until the market demands them to do it, they don't really know what they're shooting at. So they can have their own subjective view based on a conversation with any of you as to what it means to have the right carbon neutrality, or to be sustainable, or to have the right level of accessibility, or to have the right level of diversity and inclusion in their own companies. These are all things that are somewhat subjective. We're all trying to make them more objective, but they are still, for a founder, incredibly subjective. And so if you put yourself in their shoes, they're trying to design for a market, and they would die if they only talked to one customer and that customer had a great idea and they built that feature, and then they talked to another customer and that customer had an idea and they built that feature. You would never buy that product. So I think what they try to do is after having a broad base set of conversations with a lot of people, they try to create some generalizations around what people want and need. They then try to bring their own creativity and insight as a founder as to how to make it even better or brighter or different. And I think that that's maybe the process that they all need. And security, and as one example, has the luxury of something like SOC 2, where everyone can say, hey, like we all can kind of agree that if you go do this, you're better off than not doing it. And I just want you guys all to know that you need to go do this. And I think that kind of thing needs to exist here before we go beat up on all the vendors, because I think it's just not fair for them to try to solve it on their own, and they may solve it in a way that not everybody is happy with, which is maybe why we're not seeing as much movement here.
Right. Yeah. We've spoken amongst ourselves about sort of putting forward sort of SaaS standards and creating a white paper or a letter, an open letter to the industry. So maybe we need to actually get that sorted. As we get towards the top of the hour,
one
any last
suggestion
questions?
for you to ask, John. There are a couple of investor focused, I think, paragraphs that you can put in your contract that help you to define those sustainability goals when investing, and you can then force your companies to do so, which would be one implementation phase of that. And then additionally, just show us your numbers, I guess. And they're now emerging more and more tools, such as Andy Heath's company that published an open source tool called Cloud Carbon Footprint. And you can find that on cloudcarbonfootprint.org, where you can literally gather your infrastructure data and publish CO2 numbers based off what you're using. And then you can either show those numbers per user or per dollar spent or per API call, I guess, if you're a Twilio or a Stripe. And those kinds of information points, that would be awesome to us to see.
Dominic, I think,
and then we can make decisions and compare.
Yeah, Dominic, I think that's a great point. I mean, again, if I try to think through how much the world is changing, and I go back even 10 years, nobody was publishing diversity and inclusion numbers online. And so if I go back even 5 years, I think only the biggest tech companies amongst thousands and thousands of large public companies were publishing their diversity numbers. And now I think you're starting to see it's more widespread. People are saying, hey, like, we can see online that you don't have enough women or you don't have enough minorities. And so like the social pressure combined with the data being published by everybody is what's pushing the industry. And so I think, if it is something like carbon per employee or some other metrics that are very objective, I do think it's just a matter of getting people to start to publish it, because once people start to publish it, then you can do things like comparative analysis and you can create more social pressure to do so. And, I think in my personal view, we have come a long way on just creating more visibility into these problems in the last 5 years. And so it doesn't take that long, in my opinion, to at least get to the visibility phase where you can at least say, hey, like, we may not exactly know where everybody needs to be, but we kind of know who the outliers are. And if you know who the outliers are, then that is maybe a good place to start, because it drives more awareness.
Yeah, excellent. So as we get to the last few minutes before the top of the hour, and I know that everybody will have to start dropping off, I didn't know if John, thank you very much, John, for your time today. I know that we all appreciate your time and hearing your insights and your view of SaaS and SaaS marketplace. Do you have any closing statements, final thoughts to play us out with?
Well, first, I would say that at Decibel, we spend time only doing two things. One, we spend time with founders, helping them build great products. And two, we spend time with great customers and early adopters, so people like you. And I understand deeply the challenge of you want to enable people to use these products, but you also need them to be secure and compliant and to be properly managed. And obviously, as somebody who built a company in this space many years ago and now as an investor and founders in this space, I am very, very empathetic to what your job is. Some observations I would share is, one, in general, I think we just all want to be on the right side of history. And it does seem that the rise of the user and the creative forces that enable software to really capture the hearts and minds of the people that show up at work every day in your organizations is a sort of a systemic trend that I think we really can't stop. So, from my standpoint, I think, when in doubt, I think all of us are really here to try to enable this next wave of knowledge workers and information workers to do their job. And I think like on the thing that I'm probably most excited about is the more that we can educate this community to embrace the best practices around management and around security and around compliance and governance, I think the less risk that we're going to introduce into all of our organizations as we build these products. So I'm happy and excited to continue that journey with you guys.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we would love to speak to you again. I know there's probably tons of follow-up questions, and I know in a few weeks we're going to be having one of your early investor products on to come and be on SOLVETank to have a demo and answer the tough questions or answer the tough questions from our panelists here. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everybody for taking part.
Thanks for having me.